There is a sense in which none of us know with certainty where we're going. After all, who can predict what will happen in the coming months and years? For that matter, we don't even know for sure about tomorrow. We make plans and take the necessary steps to get to a place or to achieve a goal, and only time will tell whether we succeed. From the time I was 16, mission work in Brazil had been my goal in life. And in 1972, at the age of 25, against all the odds, I was in Brazil with Abby and our two children. In 1973, we cemented our relationship with the new country. We not only had a car, we now had definite ties to Brazil. Child number three, Jeff, was born there. He was under two when we left the country in 1975, but when he had a chance to go back to Brazil in the summer between his second and third years of university, his application for a visa at the Brazilian consulate was denied. The officials issued him a Brazilian passport instead. We have a Brazilian national in our family. That also meant that because he was at the right age for military service, if he had stayed in Brazil for over 6 months, he would have had to report for duty. By 1973, the first step on our journey was effectively completed. I was in the country of my dreams, and I knew where I was. The challenge? I still didn't know where I was going. Brazil, after all, is a huge country. Where was I supposed to go in that country? I wrestled in prayer over that question throughout the year and considered several possibilities. I was ready to move on, but I was waiting on a clear indication from God about the next step. One of the factors that entered into consideration was Abby's pregnancy. As her pregnancy progressed, there was even talk of her going to a doctor in a hospital in Sao Paulo. Sister Ross, who had given birth to children there, suggested that as an option. That would have meant moving 250 miles and working in another part of the mission field, in the metropolis of Sao Paulo. But I grew up on a farm, and as the saying goes, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. I was praying for something much less urban. And by halfway through Abby's pregnancy, we decided we needed to stay in Santa Cruz at least through September after the baby was born. Over the course of the year, the names of other states came up, like Mato Grosso, Goiás, but nothing says the uttermost ends of the earth like the place where the Brazilian states of Paraná and Santa Catarina border Paraguay and Argentina. A trip when I didn't know where I was and I had no idea where I was going. But isn't life like that for many people? We can put a name on a momentary experience or event, but we don't know how that fits in with the bigger picture. We need the Bible to orient us on the path to whatever happens after we end this life. We need a global view of history, both universal and personal, to know where we are in time and space. And this trip was a personal example of that. In February, my missionary colleague Steve Montgomery and I flew in his Cessna 180 to Foz do Iguaçu. That's about 500 miles southwest of where we lived in Santa Cruz do Rio Pardo in the state of Sao Paulo. For 5 days, we traveled another 500 miles by jeep over unpaved roads, and sometimes they were little more than forest trails. All I knew were the names of the towns we passed through. Now, 50 years later, thanks to Google Maps, I can match those names with places on a map and trace our route. The map shows the route we took, the inset indicating the area in relation to where we lived. This was the closest I came to having a quote missionary encounter, unquote, as many people envision missionary work. You know, the image of dense forest, limited comfort, and plenty of mud. Well, it was the rainy season. On Friday, we flew to Pereira Barreto in the west of São Paulo state. There we spent the weekend ministering to two churches in the area. before flying south on Monday to Foz do Iguaçu in the state of Paraná on the border with Paraguay. We were the guests of Senor Francisco. He's a member of a Baptist church there, and we'd met him when we crossed into Paraguay some months earlier in 1972. He was the head agent of the Brazilian Institute of Coffee. His job was to patrol the Brazilian border with Paraguay and Argentina and watch for smugglers. Knowing I was looking for a pioneer mission field, he invited us to accompany him on one of his monthly inspection trips. That week, Steve and I rode in a Jeep through areas of mountainous national forest reserves where at times there seemed to be no roads, and any roads we found were unpaved. In February, the rainy season, the highways were basically muddy, rutted tracks winding through endless forests. We were crammed into uncomfortable positions in an already not so comfortable four-wheel drive Jeep. Francisco drove. For 4 days and for over 500 miles, I sat with the Jeep's door handle poking me on the side, while I half leaned out the door with the glass rolled down to make room for Steve. He sat between Francisco and me. Steve was constantly having to shift his legs every time Francisco had to shift gears, and on those unimproved roads, that was an almost continual maneuver. Francisco's assistant and our bags took up whatever room was left in the back seat. For Francisco's monthly inspection round, using a Jeep was not an option. It was not optional, rather, I should say. Even it got stuck once, and we had to get out and push it out of the deep, muddy ruts. We crossed the Iguaçu River on a ferry that operated on a cable across the swift current. It's marked with a triangle on the map. A tractor was specifically stationed there to pull buses up the hill from the river. As the ruts were so deep and the mud so slick, passengers had to get off and walk up the hill while their bus was towed up to the top of the slope. We noticed that people walked barefoot along the roads in Paraná and Santa Catarina, and they carried their shoes in their hands. There were roadside foot washing facilities quite often, and for those who wore shoes, mud scrapers were found on the front porch of every house. The road was often steep and treacherously slick. When the Jeep got stuck in the deeply rutted slope down to the river, we had to get out and push. As Steve was walking down the hill, his feet flew out from under him and he landed flat on his back in the muddy clay. He couldn't have been comfortable sitting with a mud-caked back for the rest of the day. And I didn't laugh when he fell. Honest. Well, not out loud anyway. That first day, after 50 miles of paved highway, we turned at Medianeta, and we slid, rattled, pushed, and bounced another 100 miles along the Brazilian side of the border with Argentina to Barracão. Like Foz do Iguaçu, it's a divided town. The border between the states of Paraná and Santa Catarina runs through the town. South of the border in Santa Catarina, the town is called Dionísio Cerqueira. Barracão is the town in Paraná on the north side of the line. And the largest of the three cities, Bernardino Irigoyen, lies on the Argentine side of the border that runs north and south through the town. These aren't twin cities, they're triplet cities. In Paraná, Barracão had one church, an Assembly of God. The rain continued the next day. We spent the day looking at a bit of everything. We had a meeting with the mayor of the municipality on the Santa Catarina side of the border. It has a population of 13,000. We talked with the head of the federal police, whom I described in my journal as, quote, looking all the world like Wild Bill Hickok with his hat, mustache, and long hair, unquote. Steve and I walked in the rain to the post office to send a telegram back to our wives since there was no telephone. But the man couldn't send a telegram because he didn't have the new price list. I remember the German run hotel we stayed in because it was there that I ate tripe for the first time. We took refuge from the cold and wet weather, sitting in the kitchen where it was warm. A mixed crowd consisting of Assyrian and Italian, Germans, Americans, and Brazilians swapped stories of police and soldiers chasing gangs of outlaws. There were tales of gunfights and feuds over land and water rights. The Wild Bill Hickok look of the head of the federal police was perfectly suited to the Brazilian Wild West surrounding we found ourselves in. When we crossed the border into Argentina, I remember the crossing as being a footbridge across a stream with an army post on the other side. I described the hospital we visited as more like a three-bedroom house. And I couldn't understand anything the Argentinian there said. I wrote in my journal, it was all noise to me, like a dog barking. Wet would be the word for the week. It described the weather and our clothes. They never dried out from the first day of the trip. On Thursday, we drove 150 miles to Francisco Beltrão by way of São Miguel do Oeste, from which point the road wound through a national forest. I used the word road loosely. I wrote in my journal, at times we drove through pastures where there was hardly anything to distinguish the road from the pastures. In places only a jeep could get by. Unquote. It was an off-road experience. There was no need for signs warning of speed limits. Right-of-way was yielded based on the size of the infrequent oncoming truck and how much of the roadway it occupied. No signage required. Francisco knew the way through the forested mountains and valleys, so to get to Francisco Beltrão in Santa Catarina without any highway signs. There he met with the head of the army in the district, and the conversation again was all about chasing down drug smugglers. As for me, I wasn't in any condition to chase anything or anyone. As we stopped for the night in what I described as a dump of a place, I was quebrado. That's Brazilian for broken. I felt like I had failed to yield the right of way to one of those oncoming trucks. My back hurt from the hours of sitting awkwardly twisted, half leaning out of the Jeep window. Mercifully, the next day, Friday, was the last day of our travels by Jeep. Unmercifully, we were on the road 11 hours. Mercifully, during the last 2 hours, we were on a paved road and got into Foz do Iguaçu about 8:30 at night. The visit to Barracão gave me a lot to think about. Could that be where God was leading us to go? But the priority now was to get home the next day to my pregnant wife after being away from home for 8 days without any way to communicate with her. I was confident I knew where she was, but she had no idea where I was or when I would be coming home. Steve flew the Cessna back and we got home about 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Then I had to go to Sao Paulo on Monday to change money, where I spent the night and got home Tuesday evening at 6:30. In those days, no news was no news. Whenever I traveled to visit churches in other towns, or I went to Sao Paulo to change money, there was no way of communicating with Abby if she stayed home. We communicated with our folks here in the States by mail, but occasionally we would find a ham radio operator who made contact with a colleague in the US and who in turn would make a phone patch to our parents. Due to time differences and weather conditions, that was iffy and many times it didn't work out, but that was the best we could do. In July, Abby's mother, brother, and sister were in a serious car accident in the Ozark Mountains. A large milk truck coming around a curve turned over on top of them, and the car behind them couldn't stop before turning their car into an accordion of steel. It was a week before we learned about the accident through a letter from Abby's father. Miraculously, they all survived, but Abby's brother was hospitalized with a concussion for a couple of weeks, and His vision was never the same afterwards. Abby's mother suffered back pains the rest of her life. Not only were we living in a pre-internet, pre-mobile phone civilization, for us it was pre-telephone. And it continued to be that way for the first 10 years we were in Madeira Island, Portugal. I was invited to accompany Francisco the following month on his routine rounds along the border, but that never worked out. Bahacão was not the place God had for us. I kept looking. Steve and I worked well together, but I was itching to start a work from scratch. He and I were continually dealing with problems in various churches, and maybe what I really wanted was to deal with problems of my own making. There were thoughts of states far away, Brasilia, Mato Grosso, Goiás, or there was Ipauçu, a little town 15 miles away, but those doors never opened. It was finally in October when a door 750 miles further south opened, and we decided to move. But the one who opens doors also closes them for reasons we may only discover years later. That is the story of the last 3 months of 1973, when I finally thought I knew where I was going.